What if I told you that your morning cup of coffee almost didn't exist? In 1675, King Charles II tried to ban coffee houses in England. If he had been successful, the world as we know it might look completely different today. No coffee houses could mean no Enlightenment, no American Revolution, and maybe even no Industrial Revolution. It's hard to imagine, right? But that's exactly what we're going to explore in this video. We'll take you on a journey through an alternate history where the King's ban stuck and show you just how close we came to losing the birthplace of modern ideas. The Coffee House Revolution, a social melting pot. Picture this, a duke and a shopkeeper sitting side by side engaged in a heated debate about politics. Sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, right? Well, in 17th century England, this scene was becoming a reality thanks to a new social phenomenon, the coffee house. Now, you have to understand that back then, England was all about strict social hierarchies. Your birth determined your place in society, and mixing between classes was a big no-no. But then came the coffee houses, and they turned everything upside down. These new establishments were like nothing anyone had seen before. For just a penny, anyone could walk in and get a cup of coffee. That's right, a single penny. It was so cheap that people started calling them penny universities. Why? Because for the price of a cup of coffee, you could listen in on some of the most brilliant minds of the time discussing everything from science to poetry. But here's where it gets really interesting. These coffee houses weren't just for the elite, they were open to everyone. You'd have merchants rubbing elbows with philosophers, artists chatting with scientists, and yes, even that duke debating with a shopkeeper. It was a social melting pot like nothing England had ever seen before. Let's take a moment to appreciate how wild this was. Imagine you're a regular Joe in 17th century England. You've probably never even seen a nobleman up close, let alone talked to one. But now, you could walk into a coffee house and find yourself in a conversation with Isaac Newton about his latest scientific ideas. Yes, that Isaac Newton. He was known to hang out at the Grecian coffee house, sharing his groundbreaking theories over a steaming cup of joe. And it wasn't just Newton. Poets like John Dryden and Alexander Pope were regulars at Will's coffee house. Stockbrokers gathered at Jonathan's coffee house, while merchants preferred Lloyd's coffee house. These places were buzzing with ideas, debates, and discussions. Samuel Pepys, a famous diarist of the time, couldn't get enough of these places. He wrote about the stimulating conversations he overheard, painting a picture of vibrant spaces filled with lively discussions on everything from politics to philosophy. But not everyone was thrilled about this new trend. The elite were getting nervous. You see, all this mixing of classes was unprecedented. It threatened the very fabric of society as they knew it. Suddenly, a lowly shopkeeper could challenge a nobleman's ideas. Information and knowledge were no longer the exclusive property of the upper classes. King Charles II was particularly unhappy about this situation. He saw these coffee houses as hotbeds of sedition. I mean, can you imagine? People from all walks of life freely discussing politics and current events? That was dangerous territory in his eyes. The king was so worried that he actually tried to shut down all the coffee houses. That's right, he attempted to ban these penny universities. It was a bold move, but here's the thing, it didn't work. The coffee houses had become too popular, too ingrained in society to be suppressed. This failure to shut down the coffee houses was a pivotal moment in history. It allowed these establishments to continue serving as intellectual hubs, fostering the exchange of ideas that would eventually lead to the Enlightenment. But let's play a little game of what if. What if King Charles II had succeeded in his efforts to shut down the coffee houses? What if he had managed to snuff out these vibrant centers of debate and discussion? How different would our world be today? The silencing of ideas, a world without coffee houses. You know how they say great minds think alike? Well, it turns out great minds also need a place to think together. And in the 17th century, that place was the coffee house. But what happens when you take away the meeting spot for genius? The answer might surprise you, and it has everything to do with why you're able to watch this video right now. Let's imagine a world where King Charles II actually succeeded in shutting down all the coffee houses. No more penny universities, no more mixing of social classes over a steaming cup of joe. It might not seem like a big deal at first, but trust me, the consequences would have been huge. Take Isaac Newton, for example. You know, the guy who figured out gravity and changed physics forever? Well, he was a regular at the Grecian coffee house. That's where he shared his groundbreaking ideas with other brilliant minds. Now, picture Isaac Newton sitting alone in his study, his revolutionary concepts never leaving the confines of his own head. No one to challenge him, no one to build upon his thoughts. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? But it's not just science that would have suffered. The world of finance as we know it might not even exist. You see, the London Stock Exchange, that beating heart of global finance, actually started in a coffee house. Jonathan's Coffee House, to be precise. That's where stockbrokers would gather after hours to trade shares. Without this informal meeting place, who knows how long it would have taken for modern financial systems to develop. And let's not forget about the literary world. Some of the greatest writers in English history honed their craft in coffee houses. John Dryden and Alexander Pope, two giants in literature, were regulars at these establishments. They'd sit for hours discussing poetry, critiquing each other's works, and probably arguing about who was buying the next round. Without these intellectual hubs, we might have lost out on some of the most beautiful and influential works in the English language. But here's where it gets really interesting. Coffee houses weren't just places for the elite to gather and stroke their chins. They were democratic spaces where people from all walks of life could come together and share ideas. A duke could be sitting next to a shopkeeper, both engaged in a heated debate about politics. This mixing of social classes was revolutionary for its time. And you know what else was revolutionary? The newspapers. That's right, many of the first newspapers were born in coffee houses. These places acted as hubs for news culture, providing patrons with access to pamphlets and the latest gossip from around town. Without coffee houses, the spread of information would have been severely limited. Imagine a world where news traveled at a snail's pace, where people in one part of the country had no idea what was happening in another. It's not hard to see how this could have slowed down progress in all areas of society. But perhaps the biggest impact would have been on the Enlightenment itself. You see, coffee houses were crucial for the public sphere of Enlightenment. They were places where opinions were formed, challenged, and transformed, where ideas could be debated and refined. As historian Brian Cowan puts it, coffee houses were places where people gathered to drink coffee, learn the news of the day, and perhaps to meet with other local residents to discuss matters of mutual concern. Without these venues, the free exchange of ideas that characterized the Enlightenment might never have happened. The great thinkers of the age would have been isolated, their ideas never cross-pollinating with those of others. The intellectual landscape of Europe would have been a barren field instead of the lush garden it became. But here's something you might not have considered. Coffee houses promoted sobriety and serious conversation. Unlike ale houses, which were often associated with drunkenness, coffee houses fostered an environment of clear thinking and productive discussion. This shift was essential for the scientific and philosophical advancements of the time. After all, it's hard to ponder the nature of the universe when you're 3 sheets to the wind, right? Revolutions undone, the global ripple effect. Speaking of pondering the nature of the universe, how about pondering the nature of nations? You might think your morning coffee is just a pick-me-up, but what if I told you that it's the reason America isn't flying the Union Jack? Let's spill the beans on how coffee houses shaped the world map as we know it. You see, coffee houses weren't just an English quirk. They spread across Europe and beyond faster than gossip in a small town. And they didn't just change England. They shook the foundations of empires. Want to know how a cup of joe helped topple kings? Well, you're in for a treat. Let's start with a little place called the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't a tavern for beer? Well, yes, but after a little incident involving some tea and a harbor, coffee became the patriotic drink of choice. The Green Dragon wasn't just any old watering hole. It was nicknamed the headquarters of the Revolution. This is where the Sons of Liberty gathered to plot their rebellion against British rule. Imagine if King Charles II had succeeded in shutting down coffee houses. No Green Dragon Tavern means no meeting spot for revolutionaries. No meeting spot means no organizing, no planning, and possibly no American Revolution. You might be pledging allegiance to King Charles III right now instead of Uncle Sam. But wait, there's more. In New York, the Merchant's Coffee House was where patriots eager to break free from King George III made some pretty big decisions. And after the dust settled, it became the birthplace of the Bank of New York and saw the reorganization of the New York Chamber of Commerce. So, no coffee houses could have meant a very different financial landscape for America. Now let's hop across the pond to Paris. You know those chic Parisian cafes you see in movies? Well, back in the day, they were less about croissants and more about causing a ruckus. Take the Café de Foy, for instance. It wasn't just a place to sip espresso and people watch. It was where hot-headed revolutionaries planned the storming of the Bastille. These cafes were such hotbeds of revolutionary ideas that they had the royalists shaking in their fancy boots. One of them even complained about the mad agitation these places were stirring up among the masses. Can you imagine being so scared of a coffee shop? But they had good reason to be worried. These cafes were instrumental in spreading radical political ideas during the French Revolution. Think about it. Without these caffeine-fueled idea factories, the French Revolution might never have gained the momentum it needed. You might still have French kings and queens strutting around Versailles. Marie Antoinette may have kept her head, and "let them eat cake" might never have become the most misattributed quote in history. But it's not just about political revolutions. Remember the Industrial Revolution? Well, it turns out that was partly fueled by coffee too. Coffeehouses became centers for financial markets and places where merchants and innovators could exchange ideas. These conversations led to significant economic advancements. So, no coffeehouses could have meant a very different economic landscape for the entire world. It's wild to think about, isn't it? Without these humble establishments, the intellectual and political landscape of Europe might have been drastically different. The vibrant exchange of ideas that fueled both the American and French revolutions might never have happened. And the best part? These coffeehouses provided a unique environment where people from all walks of life could rub elbows and share thoughts. A farmer could be sitting next to a philosopher, both sipping the same brew and contributing to the same conversation. Talk about democratic. Conclusion. As we wrap up our journey through the world of coffeehouses and their impact on history, it's fascinating to see how these institutions have evolved. Today, we're still carrying on the tradition of exchanging ideas over a cup of joe, just in different settings. Modern co-working spaces and online forums have become the new penny universities of our time. They're like digital coffee houses, where people from all walks of life can come together to share thoughts and collaborate. But here's the thing. These new spaces aren't just copying the old coffee houses. They're taking that spirit of open dialogue and giving it a 21st century twist. Just like how a merchant and a poet could rub elbows in a 17th century coffee house, today you might find a tech whiz and a creative type bouncing ideas off each other in a co-working space. It's the same democratic vibe, just with better Wi-Fi. So next time you're sipping your latte in a bustling cafe or posting on an online forum, take a moment to appreciate the legacy you're part of. Who knows? Your next conversation could spark an idea that changes the world. After all, that's been happening over coffee for centuries. Stay tuned.